This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Good evening, and welcome to the next incarnation for Darwin's Legacy. It's Bill Durham and I are trading positions tonight, so I'm summarizing last week's lecture and discussion, and Bill is going to be introducing tonight's lecture and the panel, and then moderating the panel as well, just to give some diversity into what we're doing here. Last week we were really privileged to have Peter and Rosemary Grant here to talk to us with a fantastic talk entitled How and Why Species Multiply. And what they've done is they've used Darwin's finches as a case study, focusing on beak shape and beak length as a trait that is subject to selection, that's just due to food availability and to competition for food. They said that the finch radiation occurred about 2 to 3 million years ago, so there was a lot of time for things to happen. And there are now about 14 species that have distinct ecological niches. One thing I found fascinating is that none of these have yet gone extinct due to anthropogenic causes. And I think that's something that might be hopeful for the future. But looking at beak evolution and using this to try to answer the question of how and why species multiply, they asked several questions. The first one was, what are the developmental processes, what are the mechanisms that underlie beak evolution? They noted that beak depth of the focal species on Daphne Major Island is heritable, which means that you've got some genetic variation for natural selection to work on, which is the first prerequisite for evolution. They also stated that we know now that there's at least one gene that's involved directly in beak depth and in beak shape, but that gene is regulated by other genes, and this suggests that gene regulation might be the key to differentiation among species, so that the genetics that underlies how species multiply may be relatively complex, even if it does at root involve one or a very few genes. In terms of what the environmental factors are that lead to the selection pressures that then act on this heritable variation, they showed us that beak size and shape are proportional to the seed size that's available at any given time on Daphne Major. And this is driven by differential death rates that occur as a function of beak depth for those that are not well matched to the available seed size. So that when you have a really rainy period, you get a lot of small seeds. The guys that are really good at dealing with large seeds end up dying more frequently or more rapidly than those that can deal with the small seeds. And you end up with differential death, then differential reproduction to change the traits in the population. So you end up then, given El Nino effects in the Galapagos, you end up with oscillating selection over time, which can lead to directional selection if you have changes that are directional in the habitat. So you would think then that this would end up with some really dramatic shifts between species over time, some differences that accumulate. So they ask then what the barriers are to interbreeding among species that help maintain species differentiation. They talked about song and morphology and noted that just because you happen to have a beak that has a given depth, that doesn't mean you have a particular song type. That song is independent from morphology, and you can therefore, the birds can discriminate among their mates based on either song or morphology alone. Either one will do it. The males learn to sing from their fathers. The females learn to choose based on their father's song. So normally, this maintains a lot of barriers between reproduction among species, and you can maintain species in this way. But occasionally, something goes wrong. A male may die before his offspring gets to the point of imprinting on his song. There may be a heterospecific nearby that for some reason the offspring picks up on the song and you end up learning the wrong song. And that leads to hybridization, which they estimated happened about 1% of the time. The hybrids are viable, they can reproduce. They have an intermediate beak size and shape, which creates problems in dealing with the seeds most of the time. However, when there's high rainfall and small seeds, a lot of small seeds, then you end up with some of the hybrids surviving and back crossing back into the parental stock. So you end up with what they termed episodic introgression, which helps maintain that genetic variation in beak size, which is then available for this oscillating selection pressure to act on through time in the face of environmental changes. So in the end, their answer to the question that they posed to start with was as to why species multiply was it's the environment. Selection pressures that are driven by the environment are what drives the multiplication of species. How species multiply depends upon the genetics of beak variation, the divergence in morphology, which leads to barriers to hybridization, but also some leakage across those barriers as well. And they pointed out at the end that this ends up with episodic evolution, with things that happen on an episodic manner, both in terms of the introgression and in terms of the selection that happens, and that this is not strictly confined to Darwin's finches, that this happens in plants, it happens in bacteria, it happens in fish, and it even happens in lemurs in Madagascar. So it's something that's very, very widespread and is an elaboration on the kinds of things that Darwin wrote about and thought about now that we know the mechanisms for how species can actually multiply. So I think that in summary what they did was to bring us a really good crisp view of how speciation works, of a case example in which we can really learn a lot ranging from the molecular genetics all the way through to the ecology in terms of understanding how speciation operates. Now today we're very privileged to have Niles Eldredge talking to us, and Bill Durham is going to introduce him. Before he does, I'd like to point out that there's still some space at lunch tomorrow for people who want to sign up. See Joe in the back on your way out. And also you can sign up for next week's talk, which will be Professor Melissa Brown from Stanford on the area of social and cultural evolution. So don't forget to do that on your way out, and I'll turn it over to Professor Durham at this point.
It's a definite pleasure to welcome to Darwin's Legacy tonight Dr. Niles Eldredge, curator in the Department of Invertebrate Paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where he has worked as a research paleontologist since 1969. Dr. Eldredge is the author of over 200 articles, and most impressive to me is 22 books, including such titles as Charles Darwin, Discovering the Tree of Life, our reading this week, Why We Do It, Rethinking Sex and the Selfish Gene in 2004, Life on Earth, an edited volume on biodiversity, ecology, and evolution in 2002, The Triumph of Evolution and the Failure of Creationism, a topic we've dealt with here before, in 2000, The Pattern of Evolution in 1999, and so on. Dr. Eldredge's specialty is the evolution of trilobites, a group of extinct arthropods that lived between 535 and 245 million years ago. I will confess a secret love for trilobites. One of two or three interests that I share with Dr. Eldredge, and indeed I got hooked on evolution as a trilobite fossil collector in my childhood. Now I don't have the very first one that I found, but I do have a number of them to show you. Now you're not going to be able to see them from the back. So what I'm going to show you is what I traded for. Is this kid in Ohio, finding them in the shale beds of Ohio, travel the country, and I was able to trade for ones that are a little more visible. Don't you think that was a good trade? So I will admit that trilobites are how I got hooked on evolution in the first place. Not surprisingly, Eldredge's main professional interest is evolution. Throughout his career, he has used patterns in the history of life to refine ideas on how evolutionary process actually works. Noting long periods of stasis in the trilobite record, that is, species unchanging in their morphology for millions of years, let alone the year-to-year variation we looked at last week, Eldredge proposed the theory of punctuated equilibria, developed with Stephen Jay Gould in 1972, an idea that builds very much on the episodic character of evolutionary change that Carol referred to. Eldredge went on to develop a hierarchical vision of evolutionary and ecological systems in his book, The Pattern of Evolution, where he unfolds a comprehensive theory that details how environmental change governs the evolutionary process. He's also concerned with the rapid destruction of many of the world's habitats and was thereby curator-in-chief of the American Museum's Hall of Biodiversity. I hope some of you have seen that. It's a fabulous exhibit, and has written several books on the subject, including Life and the Balance, Humanity and the Biodiversity Crisis. An amateur jazz trumpeter, an avid collector of 19th century cornets, Eldredge has turned his evolutionary approach to cornet history, the instrument, and to the comparison of patterns and processes of material culture and biological evolution. Well, second point of overlap, I spent many years playing the cornet, or trying, and I'm still trying to understand cultural evolution. Last but not least, Dr. Eldredge is the curator responsible for the content of the major exhibition called Darwin, which opened at the American Museum of Natural History in New York in November of 2005. The exhibition has been to Boston, Toronto, Chicago, and is now at the Natural History Museum in London in time to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birthday. His book that we've read this week, Darwin Discovering the Tree of Life, was written to accompany that exhibition. My third confession is that in seeing this fabulous exhibit early in 2006 in New York inspired me with the whole idea of the voyage of the Beagle jet trip that Stanford will undertake this January. So I owe Niles a special thanks for that. Now he's going to ask if he can go. Dr. Eldredge lives with his wife and 400 cornets in Ridgewood, New Jersey, but repairs to the Adirondack Mountains to hike, think, and write as often as possible. Niles Eldredge.
That first trilobite that Bill held up, thank you, Bill, very much. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. Gets me all excited because that's the thing I did my thesis on that led to punctuated equilibria, that species from Silica Shale, northwestern Ohio, right? Okay. It's really great to be part of this course. I love it that it's part of a course. It's just not some isolated lecture, although I'd be happy to deliver that as well. But so I've been studying the curriculum and taking a look at everything. I was sorry I wasn't here for Peter and Rosemary's talk. I thought it was beautifully summarized though today. But apart from Janet Brown, there seems to be mostly talk about evolution today and how it permeates various facets of academic life and human life in general. And not a heck of a lot about Darwin. So I'm trying to give you a 60-minute rapid-fire summary of this man's, let me get him on here. Do I have to hit something? Page down, okay. There he is. He's looking wider up here, but that's where he is. Try to give you a rapid-fire summary, try to understand. The thing that really gets me about Darwin is that in coming to evolution himself, and I've done an awful lot of work after the exhibit opened on trying to really press this. It's really all about what is the evidence for evolution. And I think that he was probing a little bit, I'll get into this a little earlier than he's normally given credit for. This is so we're going to try to take a look at this and try to understand what it was that he saw and what he did that brought him to evolution and convinced him that evolution was probably the right idea, that all organisms have descended from a single common ancestor from the remote geological past. Because this is, right now I'm editing a journal that's trying to link the academic world with the teaching world in high schools and so forth more. And we're very concerned about teaching evolution and getting out the very best reasoning and evidence for evolution into teachers' hands. And so if we understand what it was that Darwin actually saw, we come to grips with some of the primordial, I think, elements of what the basic evidence for evolution really is all about. Now, this is the iconic Darwin. This is the Darwin that we all sort of remember because this is at the end of his life, and this is the guy that we're celebrating now, his birth 200 years ago in February of next year. 150 years since The Origin of Species was published. So we tend to think of them this way. And indeed, take a look at this. This has not so much to do with evolution. It has to do, though, why this course is actually being taught. And that's because Darwin is still an enormous figure. I mean, people don't talk about Newtonism. We talk about Darwinism. The history of physics, physicists understand a little bit. Some of them like it more than others, the history of their subject matter, but they don't spend a lot of time basically with it. I think evolutionary biology is different. Most evolutionary biologists do know something about Charles Darwin and what he did. And so what's the question? The issue here with these 2-pound notes was in about 2003, I think it was, Darwin replaced Charles Dickens on the 10-pound note. And I think that's kind of interesting. The first time I heard about it, I was in a pub in England near the Natural History Museum, and the guy who was telling me about it said, well, the public thought that Darwin had a better-looking beard than Dickens did. But the truth of the matter is all these great icons, like Charles Dickens or Freud or Marx, are beginning to fade into the woodwork of history. They're still important, it's still important historical figures for us to understand. But Darwin is still out there and grabbing us. He's the third most important person, or third, I think, most important person in British history according to a public survey that the BBC did. Why is that? It's because we have not, as a society, as a culture, really fully absorbed and metabolized Darwin's views, which after all are every bit as much about, and in fact primarily from a human standpoint, who we are and where we came from, how we fit into the world indeed as we do now. So we're still looking at Darwin and the whole subject of evolution and how it really informs, and in a scientific manner, our thinking about ourselves. And as I say, it's quite obvious in this country, but all over the world, that this job is ongoing. It just has not been completely accomplished, this sort of absorption of the Darwinian or the evolutionary message and all the implications that it has for who we are and how we came to be ourselves. But I'm particularly entranced with the person as a young boy. This is the oldest image of Darwin known. You probably, those of you who looked at my book saw this in there. I think it's really kind of cool that he's holding some plants. I mean, he was always involved with the natural world, and his grandfather and his father had extensive gardens and so forth, and there he is with his sister Catherine. His mom died when he was about 8 years old. You know, it's really interesting. He was born the same day as Abraham Lincoln. Have you got stressed that? It seems like a piece of trivia, but it's really not. Their mothers died when they were 8. And they both detested slavery. They both ended up on low denomination currencies, you know. There was even a piece in Newsweek that somebody pointed out to me a couple of months ago about who had the lasting, most important influence on our world as we're living in it today, Lincoln or Darwin. And the guy concluded it was Lincoln, and it was every bit of a good reason to do that, but the very idea that question would be asked, I think it was really kind of intriguing. As I say, I've been working real hard on Darwin's early life, and I, along with a lot of other people, have tended to overlook the importance of, well, both of his grandfathers. Josiah Wedgwood was the other one. I'm not going to show him to you. He founded the Wedgwood Pottery Works, but he was a man of great intellect and basically curiosity. He was promoting science and so on and so forth. He was a friend of Erasmus, the grandfather, author of Zoonomia and other poems and ditties and so forth about evolution. And I was reading Janet Brown, who has already lectured to you. You're very lucky in this course. On my way out here, and I didn't realize that he was actually considered, at least by English people, to be even more important than Lamarck as an exponent of evolutionary or transmutational, as they say, views. And this must have had a great effect on Darwin. I think a little bit more than is usually given lip service to, anyway. And there's Darwin's dad, who was a doctor and raised Charles and the daughters, and also his brother Erasmus, and kind of a kindly person, but he was the one who said, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you shall be a disgrace to yourself and to your entire family." That's in Darwin's autobiography. You've probably already heard that, but It's sort of the exasperation that he felt because this kid was not really doing the thing in the classical learning school in Shrewsbury at all, and he was spending most of his time either doing chemical experiments with his brother Erasmus or out there shooting, hunting, collecting pebbles and whatever, stealing apples even at one point as some of his early peccadillos. He loved collecting, and this is a famous cartoon that we had in the exhibition by one of his friends a little later in his life, but it shows his inordinate fondness for beetles, which is cribbing a phrase from Haldane or somebody. This famous zoologist was once asked by a woman, what does the diversity of life show Haldane about the nature of the thinking of the creator, and he said he must have had an inordinate fondness for beetles, so that's why I'm sort of paraphrasing it. There was a beetle mania that swept England in the 1820s, and we actually got some of Darwin's specimens for the exhibition. And so the kids were collecting them, and the whole thing was to try to get as many different beetles from the British beetle fauna as possible, but Darwin was obviously learning that beetles are not just sort of pan-mictic or spread pandemic all over England, that they occur in different habitats and so on and so forth. I can't help but feel that his early beetle collecting actually led to the development of his ideas too. Now, I can't spend much time on this, but I've been spending a lot of my own time recently looking at this in greater detail. Darwin went to medical school at the age of 16 with his brother Erasmus, who had already taken his degree at Cambridge. So they both went to medical school in Edinburgh when Darwin was 16 and Raz, I guess, was 21. And there Darwin went and heard the lectures and heard the screams of the patients, got sickened by the sight of blood and so forth. Every time I read this in some source, like Janet Brown or something, I feel that I would have been reacting very much the same way because I'm squeamish too. Anyway, he hated the whole business of operations and so on and so forth, and he felt that the lectures were very boring. And when Erasmus left to go, I don't know where he went off to another medical place in the second year. Darwin came back for a second year of study in 1826. And that's when he took up with Robert Grant. And for 4 or 5 months, this is where he got his first really practical training in invertebrate zoology. But Grant was an evolutionist. He was a transmutationist. He knew Darwin's grandfather's writing very intimately, and he also knew the writings of Lamarck. Do I have Lamarck here? There's Lamarck, the Frenchman. And it turns out, and this is something I'm just beginning to pick up on now, rather belatedly, that Grant was not alone in Edinburgh. There was a bunch of dissident, radical, evolutionary thinkers in Edinburgh in the mid-1820s. And Robert Jameson was another one. He apparently had a natural history museum that was the best in England. It was at the medical school. And he taught a course in natural history. It wasn't about medicine, it was about natural history. It was about the diversity of life and the history of life and so on and so forth. And Jameson himself was a transmutationist, and there were several other people who were known to have been transmutationists. They didn't go around and trumpet this too much, but there's that one famous time that, and I don't think I have it here, no I don't, so I'll go back to Lamarck, where Darwin records in his autobiography that all of a sudden he was astonished that Grant just sort of burst forth and extolled the virtues of Darwin's grandfather's ideas and of Lamarck's ideas. And Darwin says in his autobiography, I listened, I had read my grandfather's books with no effect on my mind, and I listened to this outburst from Grant with no apparent effect on my mouth. It was like a mantra. He was repeating it, and that's all you usually see, including in Janet's book that I was just reading on the airplane. But the very next sentence is, but it must have had an effect on my mind, considering the importance that these two men had in my life. So it's very interesting. As I say, this overview of his entire career does not allow me to go into the Edinburgh things, but more and more things are beginning to come out now. So suffice it to say that I am now convinced that when Darwin left Edinburgh, he was not an evolutionist. I mean, when Darwin became an evolutionist is really impossible to say. But he knew much more about what people had said. He had even read Lamarck, and he had read Cuvier. I hadn't realized that. So And there was an anonymous essay that was published in 1826, which is the first time the word evolution was used, according to Desmond and Moore, the first time in the English language that the word evolution was used in the sense that we use it today, in the sense that you're using it in this course. So that was an intellectual atmosphere that was rife with transmutation, shall we say. Darwin was out doing field work with Grant. There was a squabble. Grant, he felt that Grant ripped off some of his data and so forth. Grant was looking for connections between the plant and animal world. In 1826, he published a paper about this boring sponge Cliona. He said it was halfway between coral-like groups, Alcyonium, and true sponges. So he's always looking for those connections. Darwin was working with him. So I think that this has not been sufficiently paid attention to, shall we say, and a lot more work needs to be done. So then Darwin, his dad pulls him out. Darwin also realized that he was going to be an independently wealthy person. Apparently his father never told him that, but he says in his autobiography, from some small indications that I got in the summer between the two episodes at the medical school, I realized that I would never really have to get a job, you know. So he agreed with his father, though, that for respectability alone, he should go and get an undergraduate degree at Cambridge and perhaps even become an ordained clergyman. His mother was a Unitarian. The Wedgwoods were Unitarians, but his father, the Darwins were C of E, although not wildly enthusiastic about it, as one gathers. But it was a good thing. You can almost imagine that Darwin would like to become a country curate, because then he would work one day a week and then go collect beetles for the rest of his time. So he goes to Cambridge, and this part of the story is much better known, and there's a lot more attention has been paid to it. And there were two people. You ought to be an ordained clergyman to be on the faculty at Cambridge at that time. And John Stevens Henslow was a mineralogist, a crystallographer actually, a mineralogist who took up botany. And he founded the Arboretum there, or the Botanical Gardens, and the Botanical Collection, which is still there. And he started teaching a course in botany that Darwin took 3 times, and he became the man who walked with Henslow. The singular thing I think I should point out about Henslow and Darwin's working with him and taking his courses and so forth was that Henslow, even though he was a creationist, was very much convinced of the importance of variation, if not in a dynamic sense, at least in terms of recording what actually exists in British plants and what the state of the plants are. So you have these independently created species, but they vary. Sometimes they vary right on one plot, so that's sort of a sympatric sort of variation, local variation. But also they certainly vary as one goes afield and goes into different sections of England, still finds the same plant, but it's different. And so a lot of those herbarium sheets that they put together back then show variation, geographic variation in these plants. And Darwin actually collected a plant. The oldest thing that I think anybody knows of that Darwin collected is a plant specimen that's still in those collections. And he did it coming home from this famous field trip that he took with this other man, the Reverend Adam Sedgwick. Sedgwick was by that time already, we're talking late 1820s, a very important geologist, and he was the one who named the Cambrian system and got into big squabbles with Murchison about the classification of the rocks in Western England and in Wales. But he was an extremely important geologist. And Henslow said to Sedgwick, as Darwin was finishing up his degree in 1831, that he should take the lad out in the field and show him the rudiments of field geology. And this turned out, as Darwin wrote back from the Beagle, when he wrote Henslow, he said, please tell Professor Sedgwick that I am using his teaching on a daily basis out there in the field. And this was critical. Darwin learned how to approach stratified rocks and make some sense out of them, and also how to correlate them from one locality to another so that you got a sense of the actual order, the historical order of the deposition of those sediments, just based on a trip that I think hardly lasted a week. And part of that time he wasn't even in Sedgwick's company. They had split up to do reconnaissance too. But Sedgwick was that kind of a good teacher. And these two things, the punctiliousness of collecting and making notes, that's Henslow, but also recording variation and actually admitting that nature varies, species vary. The species are created separately, but they do vary within themselves. And then there's another species over here that might look rather similar, but it has its own pattern of variation within it. And from Sedgwick, he learned the rudiments of field geology. But certainly at Cambridge, where he was at for 3 years, took his degree. He wasn't at the highest of his class, but he certainly did very well there. I lost my drift. Well, those were the three. You hear a lot about them. These were critical teachings that he got, instructions, training on how to be a scientist in the field, even though these guys were creationists. That's what I'm trying to say. Then the famous story when Uncle Josiah Wedgwood actually tells Darwin's father that it would be okay for Darwin to accept the invitation to go on the Beagle. This letter actually arrived shortly after Darwin got back from the field with Sedgwick. And Darwin's father, of course, first refused, and Darwin made one of his famous lists. He says, well, I understand you object because you think they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. You think it's going to be too costly because he was going to be an unpaid ship's naturalist, and so on and so forth. And he tried to, of course, counter those arguments with his father. And his father finally said, well, if you can find me one person who I respect, who says that this is a good idea, I'll let you go on the trip. So this was the role that Josiah Wedgwood played. And of course, he was also Emma's father, so he was also destined to become Darwin's father-in-law. So now we come to the Beagle. And again, there's so much to say about this. I'm going to try to get the heart of it. We usually all think of, when we think of the Beagle, we think of the Galapagos, and absolutely for good reason. And, Peter and Rosemary Grant are still there, following out lines of research there on the famous Darwin's finches and so forth. It is an extremely important part of the story. But it is not the whole part of the story by any means at all. The Beagle left in the latest days of December 1831, finally sailed, and it was a trip that was supposed to be 3 years and take it eventually around the entire world. Its primary goal, it was a trip that was under the aegis of the Admiralty, was basically to map the southern. And I don't have, just see if I can, I wish I had a pointer here. Anyway, the southern reaches of South America, both on the Atlantic side and on the Pacific side. And because the maps were poor, and this was hydrographic maps they were doing. They're charting the waters down there. Why? Because there was two reasons. The Brits had just taken the Falkland Islands from Argentina. And I was surprised, but Argentina was already free from Spain by 1828. They had seized the Falkland Islands. They were already in southernmost Africa. Cape Town is shown there. And they were in Australia. So what they were really after was economic and military force, control, basically, of those southern seas. And that was the goal and the whole purpose of the ship's mission. Darwin was supposed to, in the thinking of the captain, Fitzroy, to spend most of his time on land, which was fortunate because Darwin turned out to be so horribly seasick most of the time, looking for economically valuable mineral deposits, which he never found. He found all these other things, all these great riches, intellectual riches. We have a pointer. Okay. Now I'll probably not use it, but so. Great. So I'll use it now. That's Robert Fitzroy. Fitzroy was independently wealthy. He had already been down with the Beagle on a prior trip. In fact, this is the famous, I wasn't going to show this, but I think it's important to show the Fuegians. You know that story that when he had been there, he'd taken back 4 Fuegian people. So that's basically like taking them back as live specimens. It's kind of wild. And take them back to England, and where they learned English and learned how to dress in the manner of English people. They actually even met the Queen. One of them died, and they were now being repatriated. And Darwin got to know them on shipboard. And the whole horrible story, which is basically a sidelight to what I'm trying to do, except for it bears on Darwin's notions of humanity and how it actually how humans tie in with a broader evolutionary picture, which he was beginning to play with when he was actually on the Beagle itself. And I think the most interesting thing about this is that he found out that the natural variation in human beings embraced all the same sort of basic properties that human beings have. I mean, here these people learned English, and they learned the manners and customs very quickly of English society, and yet when they were left off, and the whole story is a big tragedy, basically, and then they came back 6 months later to check on them. Some of them had disappeared. I can't even remember which ones that you see here. And it's totally reverted, of course, to their culture. They could hardly remember any English. They were supposed to establish a missionary-type community there and convert all of their fellows. And instead, of course, they reverted to their natural state and were Fuegians again. And so Darwin saw that the capacity for all manner, the entire spectrum of human behavior, was actually latent in people that you wouldn't think, being a Victorian or proto-Victorian gentleman as he was, would be necessarily latent in naked savages, as he called them, down there in Tierra del Fuego. So I think this is important, well worth just noting as we go through, because Darwin, when he finally sort of came out and admitted privately in his notebooks that he was a transmutationist, did not shy away from including human beings from the get-go in that scenario. Now, this is some new stuff. I just basically added this slide last week to this talk. Darwin he has all these experiences. He goes to Brazil, he sees the rainforest for the first time, he's transported with joy. He says the mind is a chaos of delight. That's all famous. It's more of a biodiversity story, though. And he doesn't see anything in Brazil that I think really gives some hints about what he's thinking. He gets to Bahia Blanca. There's two localities there, Punta Alta and Monte Hermoso, in the autumn of 1832. And he collects these fantastic skulls and bones of these giant extinct forms of edentate mammals now, and I'll show you a couple of pictures in just a moment. He also had another locality, though, and I think this is really the smoking gun. Collects the teeth and this jaw here, and then the lower part of the legs of a small rodent. And he thinks that they are, in his geological notes, but also in some of his letters back to Henslow, one of his letters back to Henslow, he actually says, I think that they're actually the remains of a lesser species, congeneric with, though, in the same genus with, the current Patagonian cavy. So not much has been made of this, and actually if you read the Journal of Researches, the Voyage of the Beagle, or certainly the Origin of Species, you don't find any mention of this at all. It's only in his letters and his notes. And I'm going to get back to this because he keeps harping on the importance of this particular fossil. Other things, though, was he says he's getting the osseous polygonal plates, and so they are the part of the carapace, I will point to this, of a glyptodon. This is not the particular species that he was there. And he said, well, there's 2 or 3 species of armadillo running around on top of the outcrops, and they were capturing them and eating and so forth. And these look like nothing less than the remains of some giant forms of armadillos. Although he was a little vague about it. He says they might have been also the bones of, the carapace might have been from a giant sloth. There was some argument back then about who had what kind of a carapace and so forth, but he found the bones of giant sloths too. Now, armadillos are peculiar, as he said, to the Americas. We have 1 species in North America right now. There are, I think, 9 species in South America still alive. And of course, there are 2, maybe 3 species of sloth living in trees now. The ground sloths are now totally extinct. But he was looking at patterns of replacement. You got living ones, and then you got these fossil things. And at the same time, in these same beds, there were the shells, fossilized shells of marine invertebrates, which he thought were the same species that were still living in the water outside in Bahia Blanca, and shooting right up through the fossil deposits into the modern fauna. So keep that in mind. It's really hard to pin this man down. He's very cryptic and very secretive in his notes. But I really do think there's some evidence that he's beginning to think now. It's like an experiment. He sees he's only really interested in organisms, species that seem to be endemic, native to South America. And he's looking at patterns of replacement, in this instance, of fossil things that he thinks are extinct with modern versions of them. He also sees at Punta Alta, and this is right there in his diary, and people have missed this, but I think it's pretty neat. And apparently Cuvier had already pointed this out, that this is a fer de lance, or in the group of fer de lances, and he says it's a very fierce, very venomous reptile. It's intermediate, marks the passage, he actually said, between adders and on the one hand and true rattlesnakes on the other, because it's got this funny nubbin, cask-like nubbin at the end of its tail, which it rattles like a rattlesnake, but it's ineffective. So it's a less perfect organ, he says in a letter home. Now, other naturalists who were not transmutationists were saying, let me also say, though, that a lot of people in England were just sort of begging the question and not really confronting the whole issue of transmutation. But they were good zoologists, so they were noticing these sort of transitional forms, things that seem to link one group with another, and anatomical features that seem to be intermediate between one stage and another. So Darwin was not unique in this. I'm not saying aha here, but nonetheless, I think it's really, it's a striking, so to speak, passage. He was pretty fearless too. He collected these snakes and he didn't end up getting bit by them either. So Bahia Blanca was I think, a very rich experience for him. He was thinking about, again, replacement patterns in time, and he was also thinking about morphological intermediacy and all sorts of issues like that. He then gets Charles Lyell's second volume. He had started the trip with the first volume of Lyell's Principles of Geology, and on the flyleaf he says in pencil, I looked at it in Cambridge, gift of Captain Fitzroy. And of course, I refused to even touch that book, but it's sort of too precious. At Montevideo in November of 1832, he gets the second volume. The second volume of Lyell is a diatribe. Lyell was a barrister, he was a lawyer, but also an excellent geologist, of course, arguing against Lamarck and transmutation. And he says certain things in there, it's like a litmus test. He says there are naturalists who presume that species can be indefinitely modified through time, and as against that, are they separately created, and do they remain separate, and do they remain stable throughout long periods of time? Darwin obviously digests this book, and it's always said that basically Darwin became the Lyell of biology. Lyell was sort of known for his gradualist interpretations, and also the notion that what you see around you today can be used, going on geologically, can be used to interpret the processes, to interpret structures and historical events in the past. And Darwin came back from the trip as a geologist, and he came up with his theory of the formation of the Andes, for example, a couple of years later. And it was sort of a halfway between a gradualist image and a catastrophist image. I mean, the catastrophists were already basically extinct by this time, but in their heyday would have said that the Andes basically popped up in one swell foop, shall we say, and just come charging up, at least fairly abruptly. Darwin experienced an earthquake there, and he realized that it was a series of rather smaller events. They were cataclysmic, locally cataclysmic with the earthquakes, but they were accumulated over a long period of time. So you got a sort of a stepwise, gradual picture out of that. So Lyell became very important to Darwin. Darwin was obviously reading him, but I think he was beginning to also pick trouble with him, disagreeing with him, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Then Darwin starts looking at, and you can read, he says right in the opening sentence of On the Origin of Species, he says, I was much struck by the pattern of replacement in the fossil record, but also the manner of species replacing one another as one travels southwards over the continent. And then, of course, he mentions the Galapagos as the third sort of influence where different species occur on different islands. And the best example of this are the two rheas, the two ostrich. Like birds, they are true ratites. They are related to African ostriches. And in the north, you get the greater rhea. And in the south, Darwin had heard rumors about the existence of this lesser rhea, sometimes called Darwin's rhea. And he knew, or he was told, that they only meet at one place, which is at the Rio Negro in Patagonia, and where they do not interbreed. He didn't use that word, but they don't sort of blend into each other. So he was very, very eager to see this bird. There's a lot of funny stories about it. The first time he saw this lesser rhea was on the Christmas dinner table in 1833, I think it was, maybe 33. He and Mertens, the artist for the Beagle, were out shooting, and he shot a guanaco, one of these llama type things, and Mertens shot a rhea, and that was Christmas dinner. And Darwin apparently, and he writes in his own notes, so it's not an apocryphal story, that he was sitting there eating Christmas dinner, and he jumped up in surprise because he realized, he thought he was eating an immature one of these, and he realized there was a different species. So he runs down to the gallery, and he gets the head, the neck, a bunch of feathers, and I think one leg. The whole rest of it had already been tossed out. So this became the type specimen that John Gould described back in London as Rhea darwini. It turns out it was a junior synonym because the French had already found it. But these things. But here's the pattern, though. And this pattern was to basically, I think, not haunt him, but it's just preoccupy him for the rest of the trip. He shot lots of birds, and he and his helpers shot lots of birds in Maldonado in Uruguay in the trip. And that was the basis of comparing these smaller birds, like the oven birds, all the way down as he went down. He says, this bird takes the place of this bird, blah, blah, blah. But it's most clearly seen that this one takes the place of this one southerly, and an overlap between the two of them, either geographically or morphologically, basically does not exist. So he was much struck with that. Now, I'm just going to leap ahead here, but this is, I call this the TV antenna. I mean, everybody in here is probably too young to remember the antennas on the back of TV sets, but in the day of digital TV and everything. This is the model of evolution that I grew up with. It's a gradual divergence from a common ancestor. How you get a multiplicity of species, as Peter and Rosemary were apparently talking about last week. And the model, though, is a gradual model, but it's taken and it forks this way. And Darwin basically ended up thinking that this was a dominant model of terrestrial species evolution on continents, because he didn't really know how you can get real good isolation going on. So anyway, so this is the model that I learned in school. It's, I think, almost a cartoon, and this is a cartoon, but to think that Darwin alone is responsible for giving this rather simplistic model to us. But it came out of the rheas. Those birds turned into this basic model. Because his first, I'll just skip ahead, I'll say his first evolutionary writings that are really explicit in the Red Notebook, he says that one species, probably the greater rhea, gave rise by saltation, what we call saltation now, to that second species, the lesser rhea. He changes his mind in the notebooks, particularly after he discovers natural selection and decides that the model that you see up there right now is basically explained. So there was a gradual derivation from a central common ancestor in the past of those two rhea species. All right, now, let me just put that back. Again, the next two slides, I just recently put them in. I would never have done this, but it's just too important to skip by. In February of 1835, he experiences an earthquake in Valdivia in Chile, and he writes an essay. And it's about all his thinking about extinction, but it's also about transmutation. And I don't have the time, and I didn't even bring the slides to show you what he actually wrote. It's only been published by one historian so far. Historians know about it. They argue about really what it means. I think it's really showing that he's out there experimenting like mad with transmutation. So let me just show you the two basic things. He uses an analogy, and later in life he said that he was doing this. Just as the job of British scientists was, ever since Newton, was to, no matter how religious they were looking for natural causes for natural phenomena. So they broke his analogy. Brocchi was an Italian geologist, and he said that just as individual organisms, me, you, any squirrels, whatever, any individual organism has a birth and a death that can be explained by natural processes, no matter how much God might be in charge of our births and our deaths. There are natural processes there. And just as there are natural processes, like Lyell and other people were talking about, that account for the extinction of species, there must be natural processes to account for the origin of new species. And it was the job of naturalists, it was the job of scientists to actually investigate them. So Darwin plays with the idea in this essay that species have innate longevities. They don't become extinct because of environmental change, because he saw no evidence for environmental change accounting for the extinction of his fossil species, all the ones that he encountered all the way back in Bahia Blanca. And he says that it might be possible through generation to extend, just as grafting can extend the life, the productive life of an apple tree, for example, generation might also extend the innate longevities of species, which is a modification of an intrinsic property of a species. It sort of triggers that litmus test that Lyell had already written about. So that's one transmutational hint there. And I'm going the wrong way. But he also says that species have different longevities, so species are born and die at different times. It's like a ticking clock model. They're not all concentrated at turnover points or something. It's like this. And they have different differential longevities. Yet, he says, as we know, the author of Nature has already dictated that, but it's basically Lyell, because Lyell says it's true, there has been no really gross departures from a standing crop of diversity of species. So there's a constant, more or less constant diversity of life out there. So the picture that he had was actually this. And this is thinking back to 1832. And I can show from his letters to Henslow that he was already thinking this way because he was very worried about the labels that were attached to his fossil specimens. Now let me try to explain this. It's like the Goldilocks situation. The giant ground sloths and the extinct Liptodons, they're xenarthrans or edentate mammals. They're endemic to South America. They're extinct. They have living members of the groups, but they're rather different. I mean, living sloth species, as I said, live in trees. Armadillo species are smaller and not quite exactly like Glyptodons. So it's an interesting pattern of replacing. Here's the modern fauna up here. Here are the fossils. And I already mentioned also that he had mollusks and other invertebrate marine species that he felt that were in the fossil record here were the same as those that are still alive in Bahia Blanca. So that's interesting. It means that the rocks were not all that old, and you got some persistence of these same species. What was just right in a Goldilocks sense was that cavy, that it's the congeneric. He says it's lesser than the living species. And he's also saying that since there's not a great deviation in the diversity of life, species must be born fairly handily or right pretty soon after or whatever. He's very vague about that. There can't be a long gap in disparity in time between the disappearance of the one species, the extinct cavy, and you don't know, these are samples, you don't know when these things became extinct, and the appearance of the thing that appears to be taking its place. So I think it's almost unmistakable that he is toying with the notion of evolution here, transmutation. Is he really a dyed-in-the-wool transmutationist then? No, I don't think necessarily he is. You can't prove it by this, but you can sure show that he was thinking along those lines. So I keep going in the wrong direction. Now we're at the Galapagos, where everybody thinks we should start. And it is a fantastic place. This is the youngest island in the Galapagos. Daphne Major is way over here someplace. It's much older. This thing is raw, violent, and ugly-looking thing. And it's over the hot spot. And the islands just keep drifting further south, getting older, and new ones keep popping up. And, of course, there's amazing stories there. And what this slide really says is that Darwin went to the Galapagos expecting to find a South American character to the animals and plants. He wasn't sure about the plants. He said, would a botanist recognize these as South American? But he was sure about the animals. In particular, he wasn't sure about the tortoise, as we were discussing at dinner, because he kind of thought that the sailors had put the tortoises there to serve as a food supply. One thing he did notice, though, was the mockingbirds, and by that time he knew the mockingbirds belonged to a group, mimic thrushes, that are endemic to the New World, and he had been seeing mockingbird-like birds all over South America. They were called thencas in Chile the last time he saw them, and he saw that they were different, at least on the older islands, one from another. And it's famous that he did not see any structure to the ground finches, and he didn't collect them. And this was always supposed to be some sort of a inexplicable aberration, particularly given how important, the fact that they're even called Darwin's finches, but how important they became to his story, I mean, to evolutionary thinking, and also to his story as he was to develop it later. How come he departed from all those great lessons he learned from Henslow about meticulous collecting and noting variation and so forth? If you look at the notes that he wrote when he was on the islands, he was looking for the pattern of South American character to the Galapagos in general, but little bit differences on the islands. And the best example he could find that he was sure of while he was there was the mockingbirds. When he picked up, and he wrote in his field notebook, that's at Downhouse right now, that if you look at these finches, and it's true, as we were saying at dinner, that some of the more differentiated finches, like the warbler finch and so forth, he thought they were true warblers, for example. He didn't see that they were a monophyletic group and that wasn't figured out until John Gould studied them back in England. But he looked at this melange of the small, medium, and large ground finches, and they seemed to be a jumble that you couldn't even pick species out of. The variation was chaotic as far as he was concerned. And more or less that same melange existed on every island that he visited. So in a sense, as my friend David Cohn, the historian, said, to him, as far as the finches were concerned, the Galapagos was the locality for those things. He didn't see that structure, but it wasn't the structure that he was looking for. And the finches still arguably do not really show that structure, at least not as well as things like the mockingbirds, and as he found out later, the tortoises, which were indeed native there. Okay. I always take longer to get through the Beagle. Towards the end of the trip, the captain basically freaked out the entire crew and said, I got to check my measurements in Pernambuco. And they went across the Atlantic instead of going home. And Darwin took the occasion to write up his ornithological notes and his zoological notes, his animal notes, he called them, his insect notes, and he was putting all his stuff in order. He was more or less just copying over the old stuff, but he waxes kind of eloquent here, and this is, I think people pretty much agree, and certainly David Cohn agrees, and has written in Nature with John Parker, who's runs the botanical section at Cambridge, that this is the first time you can really nail Darwin down as being a transmutationist. The passage starts out with the word asserted up there, asserted difference between the wolf-like fox of East and West Falkland Islands. If there is the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, for such facts undermine the stability of species. And then he went back in. And I agree with Cohn. I mean, he must have done that when he got to the end of the sentence, but he went back and wrote would. And I think, again, the captain had the right to inspect all of his writings. He did so once, and the captain would have been very unhappy to find out that this trip would become famous throughout all of history for being the genesis of Darwin's ideas of evolution. So Darwin, I think, was just basically covering himself there when he said, for such facts, and then he inserts would undermine the stability of species. I don't think there's any question that the man was a convinced transmutationist by the time he wrote those words. We could argue endlessly about the rest of it earlier. I think, though, it's pretty clear now that he was experimenting, I think that's the right word, with this concept, with his observations throughout the entire trip before he got there. Okay. What do I got? 15 minutes, right? Because I didn't start until quarter. Okay? So the rest of Darwin's life in 15 minutes. Let's see what we can do. Toxin on this skull, and I guess I shouldn't go off on it, but it's 2 feet long, just about. It's as heavy as it looks. And it was we were fortunate to get it for the exhibition. But this skull, it's a native, it's a species of South American mammal that you can see the tooth lying there in the plate. This was Owen's original drawing of that. Owen actually thought it was an enormous rodent, because there are some very large rodents down there, but it actually belongs to a group of extinct mammals from South America. Darwin had bought it from some kids in a schoolyard, in a hacienda yard for, I think, something like 16 shillings or something, and shipped it all the way back to England. It was almost lost at the College of Surgeons in a bombing run and so forth. So this thing has gone through hell. And it's not really important in Darwin's thinking, I don't think, really that much, this specimen, but it's just the fact that it went through all these vicissitudes and managed to survive. And it's in this slide, in this position right now, in this talk, because the first thing that Darwin did was to get his specimens, in the ones that hadn't already been shipped back, into the hands of competent zoologists. George Waterhouse described the living mammals. Sowerby did the shells. John Gould did the birds, and Richard Owen did the fossil mammals, getting them as much wrong as right, as far as I can tell. Darwin marries in 1839. This is a famous story, and the whole thing about taking up an independent life, first in the country and then down in London. He marries Emma in 1839. They have 2 children right away. And he starts secretly, and he joins societies. He's coerced into becoming, or pressured into becoming, the secretary of the Geology Society by Lyell, and so forth. But what he was really doing, as far as I'm concerned, the really interesting stuff was he was opening up his transmutation notebooks. A was a geology notebook, then B, C, D, and E, M, and N. So here's just a potpourri of them, with all of these wonderful things. And this is notebook B. Early on in it, and Francis Collins once told me that he says he tried to get as many copies of this image as he could, because he bought some copies of my book, even I gave them to him, because he says this is the kind of diagram his students keep coming up with, on a daily basis at the Genome Project. And Darwin was basically saying, if life has evolved, then there must be some sort of a tree-like relationship, and the more closely related species will not only look more like each other, but they form groups separate from other groups, and then there's a sort of a hierarchy, basically, of relationship that you would predict to see. And of course, that's what zoologists since Linnaeus, 100 years earlier, had already said, actually, that is the structure of biological diversity out there. So you would predict that structure if you were a transmutationist, basically is what I'm saying. So I used to think, and when I wrote that book, I used to think that Darwin became a much more of an overtly hypothetical deductive thinker when he got back and started doing things like this. He made similar observations with embryos and also homology. This is what you would predict to see if evolution had happened. Now I'm thinking, and this is the storyline I was giving you, that he was actually thinking experimentally much earlier than that. I thought he was more intuitive back when he was a kid on the Beagle. No, I think he was playing with 2 decks of cards, basically a transmutationist deck and a creationist deck. And there's no predictions that come out of a creationist deck, except for you're not going to see anything happening. So one of the predictions that you would see out of a transmutationist deck, well, replacement patterns in time and space would be 2. So that's what he was actually doing. But nonetheless, this is iconic. This is the E equals MC square of evolution. We did a show on Einstein before we did the Darwin show. We had the original manuscript with the original E equals MC squared in it. And so I was very happy to follow up with, obviously, the evolutionary version of it. And then the story about his discovering natural selection. He finds himself reading Malthus for amusement, probably in the Athenaeum Club up in London, because he didn't have a copy of it himself. And this, we won't struggle through this, but he characterizes it like a force like 100,000 wedges. It's a very sort of feverish, sort of a poetic expression. You can read this entire section here. I mean, the stuff on top where it says page 461, lower slurring, that's not about it. But then down, most of the rest of it, underneath that line, this is, that's not coming through very well. But don't try to read that. I don't think I could read it from here either. But it's very poetic. But I've read that many times now, and it's impossible to derive a really clear understanding of what natural selection is from that passage. However, 6 months later, or whatever it might have been, in Notebook E, he parses it in this incredible logical fashion. He says, 3 principles will account for all. That's what this is. Grandchildren like grandfathers, grandmothers might object. Tendency to small change, especially with physical change. Darwin, in concert with a lot of his peers back then, thought that there was environmental determinism influencing the expression of variation in populations. Kind of hip to go back to that a little bit these days in certain contexts anyway. But when I grew up, of course, that was a no-no. But there's variation out there, in other words. And it's heritable variation because grandchildren are like grandfathers. And then the Malthusian point, great fertility in proportion to support of parents. He said, we all thought that, to the extent it was thought about, people thought that organisms tended to make enough babies just to replace them after they went. And they just never even thought about it. They never saw this sort of cascading geometric increase that was intrinsic in reproductive biology. And the example that Darwin later on developed is very telling. It's about elephants, and giving a very conservative rate of increase of elephants. That he says in 15 million years, left unchecked, the world would be standing room only in elephants, which is kind of interesting. That phrase, standing room only, is decidedly Victorian. Jenny the orang, again, just a side on human evolution. Darwin was allowed to visit. This was the first orangutan in the Regent's Park Zoo in London. Her name was Jenny. They dressed her up. Queen Victoria said she was disagreeably human. Darwin thought she was human too, human-like, and did simple experiments, whether she would react to noises, sounds, music. I think he gave her some candy and some scents and so forth, and then went home and did the same thing with William and Annie, his 2 infants, which I think is distinctly sort of un-Victorian gentlemanly, but you can see obviously where his mind was going. My favorite piece of writing of Darwin's is his 1842 pencil sketch. And I think, more pages have just been discovered of this, which is very, very exciting. I think 6 or 8 pages were just discovered in Cambridge this year. This thing reads like his notebooks. I sort of gloss very fast through those notebooks. Those are sort of a melange of points as he's walking around, or I don't know, and thinking about things. And some of them are just mere reminders to go read somebody else. But then other things, you got these gems like natural selection and the tree of life popping out. This essay is written not as a real formal essay, but it's the first shot that he takes out of making a coherent exposition of his evolutionary thought. And it's in the very same structure as The Origin of Species. He talks about basically variation and selection in the first 3 chapters, and then the evidence for evolution follows. And that is the structure that persists all the way through. And every once in a while, it breaks off, and it has the character of a notebook because he hasn't gotten stuff figured out. This is a very fun thing to read. I heartily recommend it because you can still see that mind at work. And as you go through, it gets less and less thrilling, at least to me, after you do all of this. They moved to Down House in 1842, right after he wrote that pencil sketch. There's Down House now. Puts the sandwalk in, the famous thinking path, in 1844. There's the greenhouse as it exists today, but it's got all the experiments now. David Cohn and other people have worked to set up Darwin's experiments. And then he writes this 1844 essay, which is quite much longer. It's like a couple 100 pages long. This is the one that he tied up, and he put some ridiculously large sum of money, like I can't remember what it was, 480 pounds or something like that, in his will, instructing Emma to publish this should he die before he publishes his evolutionary ideas. 1844. It is the forerunner of it. There's grandeur in this view of life. There's all sorts of stuff that you see in The Origin of Species already there in 1844. So much for people thinking that he ripped it all off from somebody else. I mean, it was all down there. The man just didn't really publish it. And here in 1844, this is the famous Confessing the Murder. I won't take you through the handwriting, but he says, besides, and here he goes, he starts now telling his friends, this is Joseph Hooker, the younger one, botanist at Kew, besides a general interest about the southern lands, I have been now, ever since my return, engaged in a very presumptuous work, and I know no one individual who would not say a very foolish one. I was so struck with the distribution of the Galapagos organisms, et cetera, and with the character of the American fossil mammifers, et cetera, that I determined to collect blindly every sort of fact which could bear on any way on what are species. I have read heaps of agricultural and horticultural books and have never ceased collecting facts. At last, gleams of light have come, and I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, and of course, he was thinking about this stuff all the way back in 1832, that species are not, it is like confessing a murder, immutable. Now again, at dinner we were saying, I mean, apparently Janet Brown was saying, there's two stories here. Why didn't he publish? Was he afraid? Yes, he was. Did he want to get it right and do a better job than the, what was that book in 1844, that Vestiges, of Creation by Chambers? Yes, absolutely, because he knew he'd be slaughtered by his men. You know, the most, what can I say, upset and critical review, basically angry review that I know of, that was written on The Origin of Species, was written by Adam Sedgwick. So Darwin was right to suspect that his mentors, you never try to impress your mentors, you got to go after the kids, you know, so always. I mean, everybody basically should know that. So he's finally getting out, he's beginning to tell people, but he's holding it back. And I think both reasons are there. He wants to get his story straight, sure. But I do think, well, there's Joe, that it's been overblown about the barnacles. I mean, what, 8 years on the barnacles? Good work, very good work. It's still a sort of a focal point of systematic barnacle work. It's half on the living fauna and half of the world and half on the known fossils back then. I am not disparaging the work at all. And people say, yeah, well, you can see variation. He talks about variation. Well, these things ecotypically vary like mad. So my question always is how much internal anatomical variation is there? And apparently does talk a little bit about it. When he sees it, but I don't think that he felt. It was developing his bona fides as a systematic zoologist, sure, but I really don't see the barnacles as being more, in terms of the development of his evolutionary thinking, it was all there. It was all there already, except for the principle of divergence, which nobody has basically adequately dealt with, and that was in the 1850s. So the barnacles, I don't buy that story. That's Annie's box up there on the right. That's her writing box. She died of apparently of tuberculosis, and it was the greatest tragedy of Darwin's life, hands down. And the family feel that if whatever vestiges of religious sensibility he might still have had in the late 1840s, it was certainly by 1851 and his daughter's death, they're basically gone. And he's struggling. And a year or two later, he begins organizing his notes to write his big species book. And he's finally going to go ahead and do it. And I think, in some sense, these two events are connected. He takes up pigeon breeding. Now, this was all about, of course, about looking at how you can modify domestic stocks into this tremendous array of variation. He says in The Origin, you know, believing as I do that you shouldn't write about something you don't have any practical experience with, I selected pigeons to learn about artificial breeding. And he joined 3 pigeon clubs, 2 gentlemen's clubs and a working man's club, and learned the ins and outs of pigeon breeding. And of course, that was important. And the title of, and I wish I had it exactly, but the title of Alfred Russel Wallace's paper that Darwin got in 1858 that just completely blew his cover and made Darwin actually drop everything and so on, write The Origin of Species, was on the tendency of forms in the wild, or something like the species in the wild, to depart indefinitely from type. And the big argument against evolution from the point of view of artificial breeding was that if you release pigeons, pouters and racing pigeons, homers, whatever they are, all the different kinds of pigeons, make a interbreed in Trafalgar Square, they're going to revert back to the wild type. the type that you can see still in some places in Spain and in North Africa that were not escaped ones. So that was the title of Wallace's thing. And of course, natural selection was his discovery, and then his proposal for keeping species, differentiating and keeping them apart forever in the wild was natural selection. And of course, we know the story about that, the paper that was given in 1858 in June or July. And at the end of the year, the head of the Linnaean Society, they picked, Lyell and Hooker arranged this, and they did not go to the Geological Society or the Zoology Society because it would have been seen as too contentious. They went to the Linnaean Society, where it actually, this paper of Wallace's plus two excerpts of Darwin's, one from 1844 and one from a letter to Asa Gray. At the end of the year, the president, as I wrote in the book, of the society said it was a boring year. Basically, nothing really very important happened. But there you are. This is his study where he wrote on the origin. Oh, let me just point out one thing, because the first time when I was just getting going, I met Randall Keynes, who was a great-great-great-great-grandson, I guess, of Charles Darwin, and I was standing in the study with him the very first time I was there. And I said, you know, he became a recluse, and it's so different from the athletic, active young man on the Beagle. He becomes a recluse when he gets home, and he sets up shop here. And he says, well, what do you say? I say, well, this seems like two different guys. He says, no. He says, there's every connection in the world. And he pointed to this file thing over here, these shelves. And they were used, each one of them had the notes and the manuscript for a separate chapter of The Origin of Species. And he said Darwin always said that he learned how to deal with the economy of space when he was on the Beagle in this horribly cramped little cabin that he had on the poop deck of the Beagle, where he couldn't even, he had to stoop to enter the thing. He strung up a hammock at night to sleep, and those guys, they had to be really, and he shared it during the day with a cartographer, so they were really cramped for space. So he learned a lot of things when he was on the Beagle that he actually did transfer to his life. Nope. This is our recreation of it for the exhibition. Couldn't resist showing you this. And the curator at Down House, Tori Reeve, when she came to New York twice when we were doing this to help us set this up, she told me that, see where that green lamp is back there? She was back in that corner, and she had just gotten off the jet plane not too many hours before that. And she said she sort of felt an out-of-body experience. She didn't know where she was because it was such a close emulation of the original, And that's, of course, a restoration of the original at Down House. So we were kind of proud of that. Cost at Sotheby's $250,000 now to get a single page of The Origin of Species. That's the one that we have. And that's it. He's written so many books now. You think that he wrote 25 books. I don't know. They're great tomes of research, fantastic things that he did the rest of his life. He was always active all the way up to the end. Died in 1882. He was supposed to be buried in the churchyard at Down, and of course, political movements being what they were, he was actually buried beside Isaac Newton in Westminster, thank you. Westminster Abbey, absolutely. And I'll just close. I'll say I was, the first time I ever went to England, and we went to Westminster Abbey. I was looking at the slab crypt of Isaac Newton, and I was standing on Darwin's. I just couldn't believe it. I had no idea. So thanks very much. I hope you got something of the nature of this man's great creativity and his adventure, his thinking adventure. Thank you.
We turn now to part two and to the panel discussion, where we'll at the end invite your questions. Our first discussant this evening is Professor Ward Watt, my colleague in the biology department here at Stanford. Professor Watt received his academic degrees through the PhD from Yale University. He and his research group seek to understand the mechanisms of evolutionary adaptation. They use animal model systems, most often butterflies of the genus Coleus, to pursue this goal, using techniques ranging from DNA sequencing at one end, enzymology, up to wind tunnel flight biophysics, field ecology, and population genetics. At the other end, Dr. Watt and his students investigate molecular and physiological mechanisms of genetic variation, its interaction with ecological niches, and the resulting evolution of phenotypic organization. The work is uncovering the mechanisms, both behavioral and physical, by which insects regulate body temperatures, and is suggesting new approaches to the question of why thermal regulation is adaptively important. Professor Watt is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has been both trustee and president of the California Academy of Sciences. He has been awarded Stanford's Dean's Award for teaching fabulous courses on evolution, biochemical evolution, and biosystematics, and won the Alan Cox Medal for excellence in fostering undergraduate education. Professor Watt.
Well, thank you, Bill. Can people hear me? Okay. I don't know if the mic's on now or not, but I'll try to project. Niles, one thing that strikes me reflecting on your masterful presentation of Darwin's life in an hour, and that kind of compression is astonishing. You've made it very clear how he, from the outset, was looking at the world around him and testing ideas against it. And there's an aspect of that that doesn't often get the attention that I think it deserves, which is Darwin's prowess as a conceptualizer and really as a theoretician, as a theoretical biologist. He's noted for this painstaking decades of accumulating, as he said, every conceivable fact that might support his views in one way or another. But relatively few people have focused on this conceptualizing power, although at the end of his life, as he was writing up his autobiography, he alluded to it himself in some ways in his expression of his view that the whole Origin of Species monster tome that it is, and as he thought, an abstract of his theory. If it really had been an abstract, well, I would have hated to try to read the book. But he spoke of the Origin of Species as one long argument. And the historian at Leeds, M.J.S. Hodge, has focused a bit on this point. But it's really worth emphasizing here that if you take the abstract, all 600 and whatever pages of it, and boil it down, separate all the supporting evidence that he found year after painstaking year, what you end up with is something that I like to describe in my introductory course on evolution exactly as Darwin's theorem. You end up with something that is as rigorous in its given starting points, in its central postulate, and in its conclusions as anything in Euclidean geometry that used to be the model for logical thought that everyone was supposed to be exposed to learn how to think. Sometimes it did and sometimes it didn't, as we all know. But here's Darwin, and he has three givens, each of which is, of course, massively supported to one degree or another in the Origin of Species. Organisms vary. We're, of course, among the most variable species we know in many respects. Some of that variation is heritable. Darwin didn't have much idea how. In fact, some of his mistaken ideas on the mechanisms are a little amusing, although perhaps not suited to a general audience. And thirdly, the observation that some of that variation is adaptive, is allowing its carriers to perform biological tasks differently in the environment. And those are things that any clear observer, particularly with Darwin leaning over his shoulder to point them out to him, can verify for her or himself. And then we have the great postulate, which was the insight that he had in September 1838, provoked by Malthus. And he must have been being sarcastic. You cannot read Thomas Malthus for amusement.
Yeah.
I mean, quite aside from the dismal tone of his message, he's one of the worst writers ever to sully the English language. Just terrible. but provoked by Malthus in any event. Here's his postulate, and it was this that Wallace, 20 years later, literally to the year, was inspired to understand by contemplating his own mortality in a fit of malaria. You know, that the postulate is that those heritable variants that differ among themselves in performance, if those performances are differently suited to the environments in which the organisms live, will result in, as Darwin put it, the best chance of surviving and of procreating. Now that's a postulate, and it can be wrong. It can fail to function. And Peter and Rosemary, who spoke here last week, have documented some of the nicest cases of it in the case of the Darwin's finches on the Galapagos, and the rare occurrences of heavy rain when the seed load is just overwhelming. And it doesn't matter if your beak isn't as functional for picking up those seeds as somebody else's, because there's so much food around that, as the saying goes these days, even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every now and then. Even a misadapted Darwin's finch has a full belly when the seed load is that high. So the postulate can fail, and when it does, the conclusion isn't reached. But the conclusion, of course, to Darwin's theorem is that these best adapted variants will have the best chance of surviving and reproducing in general, and will therefore come to predominate in their populations over time. And almost as a corollary and an afterthought, oh yeah, and in different environments, this is where different species come from. You know, that's a remarkable concatenation of very stringent logic combined with the empiricism that you've documented that he was pursuing from a very early age. And I think that's something that we all do well to think about in understanding why his ideas had the extraordinary impact at the time that they did.
Thank you, Ward. Terrific insights. Our second discussant is Professor Elizabeth Hadley. Professor Hadley and her students study the ecology and evolution of vertebrates from both fossil and modern assemblages. A key question they ask is, what determines and maintains vertebrate diversity through space and time? The temporal variation they look at includes events from hundreds to millions of years. Elevational, latitudinal, thermal, and other environmental gradients of particular interest, scaling from the local to the global. Her lab studies vertebrates from amphibians to mammals and includes work in India, Patagonia, Southeast Asia, and North America, especially the Yellowstone ecosystem. They are particularly keen to ascertain ecological and evolutionary responses of vertebrates to environments of the Holocene, that is the last 10,000 years, especially responses to Holocene warming. Dr. Hadley and her research group have gotten very good at detecting historical population bottlenecks using genetic data and at inferring the timing and severity of bottlenecks from ancient DNA. Dr. Hadley teaches courses on biogeography, the biogeography of disease, evolution and ecology of South American biota, evolutionary paleobiology, and the evolution of body size. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you. And thank you, Niles, for that great insight and talk. I have to say that I recently came back from South America after spending a year there, and that was an opportunity for me to read The Voyage of the Beagle in great detail with a lot of, on-hand observations in that place. And the very first thing I have to say is that it is so accessible. It's so readable. And for me, Darwin was addressing many of the same questions across that landscape that I do in my work. And to pick up something that is so old and to find sentences, paragraphs, and ideas that immediately resonate with work that I do is tremendously enjoyable. So with that background, I have to say that for me, one of the big perspectives that I share with Niles actually is how important South America itself, we had a little bit of a debate about the Galapagos with Bill, but for me, in reading The Voyage of the Beagle, how important South America is to Darwin's ideas of evolution, natural selection, variation, and I think we were awfully lucky that that's where he ended up. I think that Darwin is, in many ways, a remarkable natural scientist and natural historian, as Niles points out in his book. And I'd like to just I just jotted these ideas down in reading The Voyage of the Beagle. I was struck with his eminent ability to describe now still ideas that are really extraordinarily valuable and insightful about latitudinal gradients of species. He commented about changes even in oceanic forms as he went south, closer to the poles. He had extraordinary insights in geology. Part of that was his background in geology, but he had insights both on uplift and erosion, the amount of time and energy that a stream over long periods of time, that gradual kind of event could really cause lots of change. But he also, as Niles mentioned out, he observed an earthquake and watched a volcano erupt. And so he had this sense of what, kind of major events could also do to the landscape. So I agree that this balance of uniformitarian kind of gradual processes, but occasionally interspersed with dramatic events, really spoke a lot to him. He observed and documented the process of fossilization. He talked about how floods took massive numbers of, he talked about native and non-native domestic animals, but how these floods actually buried bones and why you could reveal, death assemblages. So he observed this from historic specimens and was able to make big, important leaps about how that would then preserve specimens over millions of years. He talked, interestingly, and something that resonates a lot with me now, about introduction of non-native species and how that could degrade the landscape. He particularly focused on this in the Falkland Islands, and how competition with introduced species could lead to the demise of native species. As Niles mentioned, he described a bit about human variation, but he also talked about cultural differences among the different countries and the peoples that he encountered across South America. He observed faunal turnover. Again, a great insight that Dr. Eldredge gave us was that he was really playing against spatial turnover and temporal turnover, both of which are important, I think, for Darwin's insights. He talked about ecology in this interesting way, in that he described, in a sense, a niche. He talked about how climate variation, how food variation, and how competition among and between individuals might serve to constrain the number of individuals within a species. That's essentially what we know of as the niche today. He talked about hibernation and observed how the environment could really change the amount of time an organism spends in the environment, how it might buffer that organism. Again, an adaptation, as Ward alluded to. He described dispersal, how beetles were discovered far, far away from land, and how that was amazing to him, how they could be discovered so far from land, and in many cases, how they were easily revived. Again, adaptations for long-distance transport and movement. And then I think, in general, to me, what I really appreciate Niles for pulling out these two quotes. One, that the tree of life isn't really so much a tree of life as it is the coral of life, with a dead base and living descendants. And this, I think, really speaks to how important it was to Darwin to describe the process of extinction. He spends a lot of time talking about imagining someone on their deathbed. And it wouldn't be so much to say that if they were ill for a long period of time, just that last little bit of illness could do away with them, much the same as extinction works in species. And then I think my favorite part of Dr. Eldredge's book was when he pulls out this quote from Darwin that says, somehow he's a machine for grinding general laws out of a large collection of facts. And I guess I just like to quote in that I just kind of summarized a bunch of those large collection of facts, but each of those insights I think are remarkable and still really salient for the work we do today.
Marvelous, thank you. Niles, it's back to you. And please think of questions you'd like to ask, and we'll turn to your questions. The microphone's on both sides. Remember the 1-minute limit.
Well, that last point that Liz just made goes to what Ward was saying too. In the exhibition, the icon of the exhibition was Darwin's one of his real magnifying glasses. Not that he had as a kid, not that he had on the Beagle, but one of his ones that were left at Down House. And that was intended to tell kids that science is a resonance between, first of all, that here's a guy, Darwin, who goes out with only a rudimentary scientific education and only the most rudimentary tools. I mean, if you think of what we routinely have in our labs today compared to what Darwin has, it's quite amazing. So that gets to the point, though, about the theoretical work. The science is a personal resonance of a human mind and patterns that are sort of latent in nature, with something coming in from the side, which is what other people have said about the same things. Of course, informed, like I didn't really describe it very well, but he had a very interesting mental relationship with Lyell, who he hadn't met when he was on the Beagle, where he actually, I think, got some courage and grew as a scientist as he found himself disagreeing with Lyell as he went on. He was not a slavish adherent to Lyell at all, and Lyell returned the favor. It wasn't until The Origin was published that Lyell came around and accepted evolution, So there's that. So he was of course, he was a great theoretician, but we're trying to tell kids in the exhibit try to tell any kid I meet that this is a very personal, very human exercise, this science that we have. You sometimes miss this because of the structure of our cultures on campuses and funding and all this sort of thing. We tend to organize ourselves in labs, maybe a little bit more than before, but this has actually always been going on. But when you get right down to it, it is the individual human experience resonating with colleagues, of course, and the written, but also the personal contacts on a day-to-day basis. But also, the fundamental thing is looking at nature and seeing that, basically, mostly you see that what you thought was true doesn't seem to describe what you're seeing very well. I think that's one of the things. So just this is sort of the essence of creativity. And I have lots of musician friends and writer friends and so on, and they would go through the Darwin exhibit and they would say for the first time they saw that science is really very similar to the best creative work that they're familiar with in the arts. And I've always felt that to be true, but I think that's one of the real reasons why I love just rubbing, that I have this fascination for this guy, that my assignment is over with the exhibit and I wrote the book, but I just can't let it alone because it's just too much there for us to find out about the very basic nature of science and human creativity. I just want one other fun thing, the Ward thing. He did start writing that great species book, and it is very good that he didn't get to finish it because nobody would have read it. I mean, it was longer than The Origin when he finally, and it was only halfway done, when Wallace came along and knocked him off his perch and made him just cut down and write this hilariously titled so-called abstract of his ideas. But I'll tell you something else. That great species book, what was done, it was published by, I can't remember who, in 1963. Mm-hmm. It's out there, and it's, of course, just unfinished. And it's largely the front-end section of what turned out to be The Origin of Species. But I very sort of unhelpfully said that nobody's really done much with the principle of divergence. It's much better explained inside that book than it is in The Origin. The Origin just has a boiled-down description of it in conjunction with the only illustration that's in there. Nobody understands it. But it is the reason why the subtitle of The Origin of Species is, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. He had a very, not group selection as so much, but differential survival of subspecies and so forth model going on in his principle of divergence. And I think it's because he was thinking back about, as Liz says, South America was so important. He never solved the problem of how you can get separate species like those rheas living out there replacing one another on the Patagonian plains. And he just basically ignored the problem. And then finally in the 1850s, he went back and he I don't even think he mentioned the rheas, but that's the problem that he had never solved. Because he didn't understand how you can get isolation, the way you can get on different islands in an archipelago on a continent, because he didn't know anything really, about climate change and how that makes redistributes habitats and so on and so forth. So so that book would have been not read, but it has some gems in it, so we should not overlook it at all.
So yet another favor we owe to Alfred Wallace.
Yes.
It's like having a deadline for your honors thesis. Nothing makes it get short and tight.
Exactly.
Right.
Questions from you tonight? Please use the microphone on either side. We look forward to your questions. John.
Professor Eldredge, thank you so much for coming and for speaking to us tonight. I'd like to ask about punctuated equilibrium.
Okay.
And if you could speak a little bit about where that concept came from, and particularly address yourself to why it has engendered such vociferous and passionate disagreements about scientists who basically all believe the same fundamental truth of evolution.
Well, actually, that's another whole lecture, but punctuated equilibria is just putting allopatric speciation, which is the rudiments of which were in Darwin, but he got rid of it by the time he wrote The Origin, basically, so it had to be resurrected. People playing a role in that was included the past president of this very university, David Starr Jordan. Keeping the notion of isolation important, and then I would say Dobzhansky. Meyer gets most of the credit. I have to say it was Dobie first in 1937. Really wrote that landmark book, Genetics and the Origin of Species, that reestablished the fact that evolution makes discrete gaps between species. It's a speciation process. So I came along, and Simpson had written Tempo and Mode in Evolution, and he said that the gaps in the fossil record, at least between a larger, higher scale taxa orders and families and so on, reflected something about the evolutionary process and not bad data in the fossil record. And Darwin had a whole chapter on taphonomy. See, this is my other hat. I've spent most of my life arguing with Darwin, and I think as a kid, that's what really got me. You read his notebooks. He and I were thinking a lot, I was part of a movement that seriatim, starting with resurrecting isolation and speciation, but then recognizing stasis, which he certainly recognized and he knew was so, but he thought it was a good objection to his theory, so he basically got rid of it and explained it the way as bad data. So it's again, punctuated equilibria is the recognition that stasis is actually an empirical phenomenon that's been known and well documented for ever since Darwin, even before Darwin, with this resurrected concept of the importance of isolation and geography in the evolutionary process. That's basically all it was, and all it is. So I don't see it as controversial, but it was taken, in a sense, not unfairly, to be anti-Darwinian, because that is not the message that he left us in The Origin. And basically, I think the fragment, Darwin was probably the last person of any real substance who understood the rudiments or the basic levels of all of the fields of biology and paleontology and geology that were relevant to this subject. And we've been fragmented ever since on university campuses and elsewhere. And we're all studying different parts of the elephant, different spatiotemporal scales of the problem, and putting it back together. I mean, nothing in punctuated equilibria has anything to do to say that natural selection isn't right, or any of these other microevolutionary processes that are so ably documented and have been all along are somehow irrelevant or not right. They are all right, and it all has to fit together. But some of these larger scale patterns, and I have to say from the fossil record, have been basically swept under the rug. Darwin also knew about he had read Cuvier. I just found that out coming out on the airplane. I didn't know that. Jameson had translated Cuvier, and he'd read it when he was in Edinburgh. And in that 1844 manuscript that I showed you, his son, Francis, in 1909, 100 years ago, celebrating Darwin's the 100th anniversary of his father's birth, published those, the 1842 and the 1844, the sketch and the essay, And he has a footnote, and he says that Darwin, and I think that's in my book, that he says, that Darwin says, better begin with this. If species, after catastrophes created in showers world over, my theory falls. And they are, very often, after mass extinctions and in even more minor extinctions. I think most of the morphological evolution in the history of life is tied up in events like that, probably. That's an extreme view, but I think a lot of it is anyway. And Darwin knew about that, but he swept it under the rug. So all we were trying to do, so we seem to be anti-Darwinian, and we maybe were a little bit argumentative ourselves in our way we approach the world, but sort of in your face a little bit. But it was a climate that we were in that basically didn't recognize any of those patterns. Darwin himself stopped looking at the patterns. The thing that gets me about Darwin is that it was fossils that took him to the idea in the first place. And then he just ran out from it. So, anyway. So that punctuated equilibria is an attempt to basically, I think, sort of get some of these empirical things back into the mix.
Another question. Other questions from the group? Come on now. This is your chance. Sue.
I'd like to hear more about the exhibition. How do you find out where it is at any given point in time? How long will it be going on? When will it come back to the U.S.? How do we see it?
That's great. And I think, I gather from that you're saying that the American Museum website is not doing the job.
It's there. It's still there.
Is it
It's probably there.
Yeah.
I just probably haven't checked.
Yeah, well, the answer is actually there are many forms of the exhibition right now. I'm very happy about this. It sort of has speciated, and it's all over the world. So the original is in London now, but it's going to go to San Diego afterwards. And I believe we've got other venues in the United States, but I don't know what they are. So it'll be in London until, certainly through the birthday, probably sometime in the spring, and then it's going to come to San Diego. So that's good news. But it's been in Japan, a clone of it. It's been in Japan, and it's in Australia now, or soon to be, and it's been in New Zealand. It's been in Brazil. The Brazilians bought the rights to it, built their own version of it. It's not bad. Now I'm having a lot of fun helping some venues sort of make it more sort of suitable to them by talking up Darwin's connection. So in South America, it's a no-brainer. But specifically his stuff in Brazil and his anti-slavery feelings and so forth, we put that in there. It's going to open in Italy, in Rome. It's going to go to Milan after that, and I think one other venue. And it's also a separate version is going to be in Lisbon, which is going to emphasize much more nearly modern evolutionary biology, but it's going to have core elements from it. So it's wonderful. It's a lot of fun. And now I'm into seeing people. I didn't want anybody to touch it, at first, but now I think it's a lot of fun. It should come out here, and you should get the Calicad's Galapagos stuff and just completely transform that exhibition into, and just stress the strengths that you have. The stories can be told, but emphasizing and utilizing resources that are not available to everybody.
So is the Natural History Museum website the best place to track where it is at any given point in time?
Well, I have heard people complain that it's not terribly informative. So you know what I know now, but I'll try to prod them back at home to see if they can be a little bit more forthcoming about this information.
Next question here, and then we'll go to the other side. Mm-hmm.
In his notebooks, did Darwin have any comments about the isolated indigenous peoples that he ran into, like the Fuegians, or others that he might have run into?
In those secret notebooks of his, or certainly in his diary, he's got a lot of stuff. And those the diary's been published in a couple of versions. And of course, in the Journal of Research, is the so-called Voyage of the Beagle. There is a lot. There might be some in the letters too. His notebooks M and N, I am not as thoroughly familiar with as the B through E notebooks. Those are his so-called metaphysical notebooks, and basically is where he's exploring human evolution, but it's very, very cryptic, so I can't remember too much. I think basically, apart from writing up the Journal of Researches, you don't see, it's disconcerting, but in the Origin, for example, you don't see a lot of South America in there. you agree with that, Liz?
In the origin?
Yeah.
No.
Not as much as,
No.
again, it's the stuff that brought him there is not the stuff that comes out in the end. And he wants more appropriate examples. He's already rewriting his stuff. The cavy, I was just saying at dinner, the cavy disappears because Owen says, oh no, it's a tucutuco, which is another endemic rodent down there, but it's not related directly or closely to the Patagonian cavy. So Darwin just goes, oh well, and just forgets about it. But that was the thing that he thought he had. That matched up what Lyell said, which is that someday somebody's going to come along and start matching up fossils of still living species and also closely related things and come up with some sort of an idea of how life evolves. And that's what he thought he had. But Owen told him it wasn't a good example, so he dropped it.
This side.
So I'm curious to know, you are a curator today, but you've also worked as a scientist, doing research, coming up with theories. How would you say your work differs today than what you were doing in the past, and what is the job of a curator as opposed to being a regular
Well, that's
scientist?
interesting. A curator, sort of generically, in any museum, is somebody who's primarily responsible for the collections, whether they're amassing the collections or putting them on display or just being responsible for their care. And that, of course, is part of our primary duties at the American Museum. But the model at the American Museum has always been as a research institution. So we have titles, for example, like universities. We have assistant, associate, and full curators instead of professors. And so our primary duties have always been to the sort of the conduct of original scientific research and the publication thereof, always realizing that mounting exhibitions, I didn't actually do an exhibition until the late 90s, that Biodiversity Hall, and I've been on the staff since '69. I always viewed exhibition work with horror because it would be a terrible disruption of just doing the research. But that back then I was doing a lot of empirical work with trilobites and so forth. I basically haven't been doing so much of that anymore, and I don't go in the field that much anymore, certainly not for any extended periods of time. Much more interested in ideas and in the history of ideas. And so then I found out that doing exhibits not only can be, it can also be exasperating, but it can be fun. But it's a tremendous opportunity to not only to learn stuff. I was scared when I got that assignment to do Darwin, and I got David Cohn and John, help me out here. A good evolutionary biologist to make sure I got the storyline right. I got a good historian in there, but I learned an awful lot. And then ultimately, the greatest pleasure is you're mounting a show, and people, more people come to that show than read my books, that's for sure. And you can actually get a sense of the reaction that people have if you go down there or you listen to people after they go through it and so forth. And so it's I never did teach that much. So this was a real sort of belated in my life experience of maybe I finally got mature enough to be able to do it and see the value of it, of communicating with a wide range of people over some ideas that I find the most fascinating, some of the most important on the planet.
We've certainly learned a great deal tonight from your ability to communicate, Niles, and we really appreciate your coming. I find something new every time I read one of Niles's books. I was surprised to find 11 volumes on my bookshelf this afternoon without even looking. And I've always found new material. What I love is his ability to interrelate the science and the history and the process of discovery. The individual and the process is really a lovely insight, a lovely contribution. One of the things I really enjoyed in discovering the tree of life, among the many wonderful details and the replacement theory and the evidence for that, and challenging the sort of orthodoxy that Darwin really came to the view of life being related by descent only after the return of the Beagle voyage. All these wonderful rich examples. One of the things I really enjoyed was Niles mentions that the publisher, John Murray, sent Darwin's manuscript on the origin of species out for review, as publishers will do, to see if it was really worth publishing. And one reviewer wrote back, "No, don't touch this, except maybe the part on pigeons."
Yeah.
Thank you, Niles. This was a wonderful, wonderful evening.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.